Yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation. I feel honored to give here the first presentation today. I also feel a little bit insecure about it because the topic of the conference and of my presentation, the sources of Russian foreign policy, pragmatism versus revisionism, these are classical international relations topics of the sort of subdiscipline of international relations, and I'm not an international relations man or researcher. I'm mainly interested in domestic affairs of Russia and of Ukraine, and in connection with that also now with geopolitics and the interconnection between geopolitics and domestic affairs. So in a way, somebody coming from international relations might be more qualified to give a presentation like that. But I would like to, in a way, try to make a case that it is exactly in a way that international relations and the different subfields of international relations don't give us a clue to, or have not been giving us a clue to what has been happening in Eastern Europe in the last 2 years, which is the problem, that people have tended to see the conflict in Ukraine and the conflict between Russia and the West in terms of international relations, although I think international relations as a topic and as a discipline and as a field of study, I would argue is actually secondary here. Because if we look at the different subfields of international relations, what has happened in the last 2 years should not really have happened, because we are now in this rather threatening, frightening confrontation between Russia and the West. People talk of possible World War III, of various escalations that could happen in Syria, in the Baltic Sea, in Ukraine, or somewhere else. But that should not have happened. If we look, for instance, on the subfield of international organizations, and of course one could analyze the whole conflict in Eastern Europe and between Russia and the West in terms of international organizations, then it looks actually quite good. Russia is a member of the OSCE, it's a member of the Council of Europe, it has been negotiating until the Ukraine crisis a membership in the OECD, it became a member of the World Trade Organization, and Russia is of course a member of the UN Security Council. But nevertheless, although we have all these international organizations which would seem to connect Russia with the West and Russia with the other East European countries, this has not helped. The same goes for international law as yet another subfield of international relations. There's a very dense body of treaties, both between Russia and the West and between Russia and the individual countries of the former Soviet Union, that would seem to prevent what has happened in the last 2 years. For instance, if we look at the relations between Russia and Ukraine, there was the Belovech agreement, where Ukraine and Russia first acknowledged the borders to each other. There was the Friendship Treaty of 1997 between Russia and Ukraine. There was before that the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. And the most important is, of course, the Russian-Ukrainian Border Treaty of 2003, ratified by both countries in 2004, where both countries acknowledged the mutual borders. And there are other treaties as well. So also from international law, from the perspective of international law, what has happened should not have happened, really. Something similar goes for international economic relations. So we are now in this confrontation between Russia and the West, and the trigger here was, of course, were the negotiations of the EU between the EU and Ukraine and the other East European countries of the so-called association agreements. This arguably, and often it's in the West, it's then portrayed that there is there is something very deep and basic and specific about the Russian-Ukrainian relationship. But we should remember that the first intervention concerning the association agreements of Russia came not towards Ukraine but towards Armenia, which had to stop its negotiations of the association agreement, although Armenia was doing pretty well in adapting its regulations and laws in 2013 to EU standards. You may have heard of a so-called Eastern Partnership European Integration Index, which was sort of measuring how far the different Eastern Partnership countries were adapting their legislation to EU standards, and Armenia actually went up before it broke off the negotiations of the association agreement, and so this is basically a conflict here between the EU and Russia, and with the association agreements. But if we look at the international economic relations that are around this should not have happened. The EU is the largest trading partner of Russia, and the EU is responsible for 75% of the foreign direct investment in Russia. So, you know, again, if you look purely at international relations, this should not have happened. It doesn't make sense. Also, if you look in a sort of international relations in a broader sense, then also this whole confrontation doesn't make much sense. So if we look, for instance, on the German-Russian relations and the current tension in the German-Russian relations, this also should not have happened, because Germany has been trying over the last 15 years very intensively to build up, and before arguably already under Kohl, but then especially under Schröder and later on under Merkel, to build a special relationship with Russia. There's the St. Petersburg dialogue, there's the German-Russian Forum, there was the modernization partnership, the strategic partnership. There was a multitude of relations between Russia and Germany, but still Germany was not able to prevent this, in spite of these very close international relations, not only in the diplomatic field, but also in this sort of NGO field and in economics and so on. This has not worked out, and I just take here Germany as one the German-Russian relations as one direction of the relations. So this leaves us a little bit, you know, I think if we just use the instrumentarium of international relations, I think that is not sufficient here. And I think the clue to understand it, and I guess some of you may be some of you may be from Russia who are here, they may be in a way offended by me saying this, is that Russian foreign affairs do not follow any longer for certain reasons national interests. So the whole sort of the whole assumption of international relations with the disappearance, I would say, of national interests in Russia's foreign relations, I would argue, breaks down. And when we speak about revisionism versus pragmatism in Russia's foreign relations, we should actually not refer to Russia as a state, but to the current Russian regime that is more or less pragmatic in its foreign relations, and it follows its own interest in its foreign relations, or that may also follow ideological aims, revisionist aims. An important distinction one has to make here is, I think, in light of this situation, before I go into this issue of national interest and why I think the Russian foreign affairs do not follow national interests anymore, and therefore they take out the fundaments under which the assumptions of international relations are built. Another thing that I have to clarify first, we're going to have here later on a paper by I think Maria Lagutina about the topic of and the concept of the post-Soviet area. There are many arguments, and I think we will hear these arguments, why this concept of post-Soviet does not apply really to the so-called post-Soviet sphere, because it covers different countries. What I would maybe here already would like to say is that a crucial difference in the post-Soviet sphere is the international embeddedness of the different post-Soviet countries. So we have certain countries that are in the Western security structures, included the Baltic countries, of course, in the EU and NATO. Then we have the countries that are members of either or and the Eurasian Economic Union and the Tashkent Treaty, or the KB as it is called in Russian. And then there are certain countries that are neither nor and that are in the gray zone. And these are exactly the countries that are so problematic today: Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine. And what is interesting about these countries also is that in all three, in the case of all three of these countries, and that again illustrates the sort of irrelevance in a way of international relations, Russia has entered multilateral agreements to withdraw its troops from these countries. So we have the 1994, of course, already Budapest memorandum, multilateral, where Russia took the obligation not to, or actually took the obligation to protect Ukraine's integrity and sovereignty, not just the obligation not to infringe it by itself. We then had the 1999 OSZE document where Russia obliged itself to withdraw its troops from Transnistria. Then we had the EU-brokered Sarkozy plan of 2008 between Georgia and Russia, where Russia was obliged to withdraw its troops from Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which it didn't do. And then we also had, of course, the Geneva Declaration and the Minsk agreements of 2014 and 2015, where Russia again in a multilateral format obliged itself to solve these conflicts and withdraw its troops from these areas. All of this has not happened, and I think it's quite remarkable. But these are the countries in the gray zone that are neither in the Western security structures nor in the Russia-dominated security structures. And although there were multilateral and of course also a lot of bilateral agreements between these countries, they did not help these countries to remain sovereign and to remain territorially integrated. So I think the clue really to understanding what is happening is that we have this rather strange situation today in Russia, and I think the strangeness of this situation in a way explains why, in spite of all these international structures and all these international relations that do exist between Russia and the post-Soviet countries and the Western countries, why we are in this nevertheless strange situation is that the regime does not follow any more sort of national interests. And I would argue that the national interests of Russia would, of course, be I would just name 6 of them, which I think would be quite basic for Russia, but which Russia does not follow or violate, or in the promotion of which it contradicts itself. So I think the paramount national interest of Russia would be modernization, of course, of its economy, its public administration, its healthcare system, its educational system, and so on. And that for a country like Russia, the primary partner for this would be, of course, the West, in particular the European Union. And what Russia is now doing, it's basically threatening all this. I think neither the Eurasian Economic Union will will be of much help to Russia in its modernization, nor will China. China certainly in certain infrastructural and economic issues it can be of help, but I don't think it is a really a strategic partner for Russia in its modernization. The second major issue, I think, that where Russia currently contradicts its national interest is the fight against Islamic fundamentalism. Here, I mean, you know, the rhetoric, of course, the official rhetoric of the Russian regime is that it is fighting in Syria ISIS and it is fighting Islamic fundamentalism. What is happening is, I think, exactly the opposite, that by sort of escalating the conflict in Syria, it's radicalizing Muslims, and it's also what is very strange. Also, it's now I think fundamentally subverting its relations to the Arab world. So what we are seeing here with the with the bombing of Aleppo is it's for us pretty it's shocking and so on, but I think it will have a much deeper, much longer, and much more problematic effect for Russia's long-term relations to the Arab world because of the humanitarian catastrophe in Aleppo that has happened. The third, I think, contradiction that I see here is that Russia has sort of infringed upon this sort of the international power play in which it was taking place by alienating itself from the West and thereby becoming more open to pressure from China. So the official Russian policy is, of course, that there is now this new partnership with Russia, and there are these meetings and all these bombastic events and symbolic gestures and so on. But my perception, maybe somebody knows more about this than myself here, is that China is not actually looking on Russia as a respected partner, but it will of course engage with Russia, but not in a partnership that will have a long-lasting sort of foundation. So we saw that in the negotiations about the new pipelines, where still some of the basic numbers are not known to the public about these pipelines that China and Russia have negotiated, and the clear perception I think that many have that China is actually taking advantage of this isolated position of Russia, that it's trying to extract as many as possible advantages for itself from this new confrontation between Russia and the West. A fourth issue is the non-proliferation and the international non-proliferation regime. Russia is supposed to be, according to the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to be a guarantor of this treaty, but it has, of course, via the Budapest Memorandum and its violation, undermined now the Proliferation Treaty. That has not yet become much of a topic internationally, but I think it will become a topic. It's only 2 years now from now, but but you understand, of course, the issue here that Ukraine was the third largest nuclear power in the mid-1990s. It gave up its nuclear warheads. They went to Russia, and it got these guarantees in exchange for becoming a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and as I mentioned already, Russia obliged itself to protect Ukrainian sovereignty, and because this is all tied to Ukraine's entry into the non-proliferation regime, it undercuts actually the non-proliferation regime. That is a problem for the whole of humanity, I would say, that the non-proliferation regime is now undermined, but it's also a problem for Russia. It's also not in the national interests of Russia. The fifth issue is, I think, the contradictions that arise from Russia's confrontation with Ukraine, with Georgia, with Moldova, in the attempted building of the Eurasian Economic Union, because the member countries of the Eurasian Economic Union, they of course look upon what's happening in Ukraine, and they start wondering what is about their territorial integrity and political sovereignty, and so they are scared in a way. And there are also economic problems arising out of the sanction regime between Russia and Ukraine, in which some of the member countries of the Eurasian Economic Union do not want to participate. And the sixth, and maybe the saddest in a way, issue is, of course, I think the fundamental subversion of the Russian-Ukrainian relations. I think I think these relations are going to be spoiled for decades. This is not just about years or about months, but it's going to be at least for a generation, maybe for 2 or 3, a huge issue. I live in Kiev, and I have many sort of rather enlightened friends there who tell me, the problem is not Putin. The problem are these 82 or 86% who support that, and there's even talk like, when Ukrainians, just to illustrate this a little bit, the depth of the grievances in Ukraine, is that there is this talk about now political emigres from Russia that come to Ukraine, and some of the Ukrainians are very, they like the idea. Yes, we want to get these political emigres and we want to give them a home, and that's important for us. But there are also rather enlightened emigres, not only ultra-nationalists, who would say no, they shouldn't come, because it's too difficult for us to sort out who is our friend or who may be an agent, who will be at the end of the day with us or who will be against us. Maybe these are these people are future fifth column of Russia in Ukraine. So just kick out everybody, just by virtue of being Russian or having Russian citizenship. Everybody should go. We are at war, and tochka, period. That's it. And whether you are a friend of Putin or an enemy of Putin is not interesting for us. We don't have the time and the energy and the resources to sort this out. Who might be among the Russian emigres in Ukraine an agent or not? So this is So I think all this illustrates these 6 points, and one could mention, of course, others. That the Russian regime is not following national interests in a traditional sense of the word. What is the Russian regime doing? I think that's also not a secret. It's not particularly original to say so. As most of you, of course, know, there was a sort of informal societal treaty between the Russian regime, and the Russian people that had emerged under Putin in times of high oil prices, which basically said, the political regime would be authoritarian, but it would secure certain socio-economic standards, and then society would not stand against it. This formal social contract has now broken down, and what Putin is now doing basically is he's offering the Russian people a new social contract, which is that you will not get your life will not improve anymore, or it may even deteriorate somewhat. But we will be again a feared power, and you will have the feeling that you are part of a world power. And here then then it becomes of course dangerous that in legitimizing this, then history comes in, and as the title of the conference says, and that the Putin regime has purposefully utilized Russian ultranationalists to legitimize this sort of new social contract between the regime and Russia. And then revisionism has an instrumental meaning for the Russian regime. I don't think people like Putin and Sechin and so on, they're particularly ideological people, but this revisionism that has been promoted via the stronger presence of ultranationalists in Russian public discourse has now gained a life of its own, and so to say the ghost is now out of the bottle, and is also now driving to a certain extent, I would say, Russian foreign policies. So what Putin has done, he has included the LDPR, the Zhirinovsky's party, in the de facto new political regime that he has created after assuming power. That wasn't clear at all that Zhirinovsky would become part of this new regime. There was also an attempt, for instance, to create another ultranationalist party, the Rodina party, but this was then regarded as too dangerous, and then the Rodina project was dismissed, and Rogozin, the leader of Rodina, was sent as ambassador to NATO. But the LDPR has become a part of the new political system under under Putin, or another illustration, the promotion of Alexander Dugin to a major participant in Russian public discourse. Dugin used to be in the 1990s an openly fascist, Eurasianist, ultranationalist theoretician who has praised at one point under his own name Reinhard Tristan Heydrich. For those of you who know German history a little bit, you will know the name. He was a SS Obergruppenführer, one of the deputies of the SS Reichsführer Himmler, and was the original organizer of the Holocaust. And Dugin at some point described Heydrich as a convinced Eurasian, thereby making Heydrich a sort of a precursor of his own Eurasian movement. Or under a pseudonym, Alexander Sternberg, Dugin has in a poem spoken of the reawakening, the rebirth of Heinrich Himmler himself, of the SS Reichsführer. So, in spite of these outrageous and many other outrageous statements of Dugin in the 1990s, Dugin has been made part of the official political system. He was even for a while a chair of a department at the Faculty of Sociology of Moscow State University, which is the leading university in Russia. He then made a few more outrageous statements that had to be dismissed as chair, but he's still teaching at Moscow State University. And you know, you could mention many other persons, the Izborsky Club or Medinsky or Kurginyan, and you know, there would be many other of these examples one could mention here. People who were marginal in the 1990s, or who are extreme in their views, and who have received access to state television and to major conferences. And now, in a way, the question appears, you know, is the regime still the driver of this radicalization of Russian society via these extremists, or is already a radicalized revisionist society driving the regime to a certain extent? Maybe I've just touched a few of the issues here, and I would be interested to hear your questions on this. Maybe one more remark on the sort of why was that possible at all? In a way, I mean, you know, it's a paradoxical situation that a country would not follow its national interests, and that it would sort of go into this mood of conspirology and paranoia and Manichaeanism and so on. But this sort of nihilistic or cynical approach is not something that we should be actually surprised about, because the people who hold power today in Russia come mainly from the KGB, and the KGB was, of course, an organization that not only suppressed the non-Russian nationalities in the former Soviet Union, but the KGB was also an organization that suppressed the Russian Orthodox Church, Russian science, Russian philosophy, Russian literature, and partly physically. Just it was the organ of the Soviet state that either repressed or executed or liquidated these parts of Russian society, or throw it out of the country, and therefore I think there shouldn't be that much surprise about this nihilistic and cynical approach of the current Russian regime. That's what these men have always been doing, and you know, this sort of betrayal of Russian national interests is not something that should surprise us. And maybe as a final conclusion, I think the Western policies towards Russia would have to adapt to this new situation. I think many still, at least that's what I observe in Germany, they are trying to understand Russia in terms of international relations, as I mentioned in the beginning, in terms of the economic international relations of Russia, of international law. They would refer to Kosovo and the Iraq and so on, and all these things. There would be then, there's a whole body of literature that would sort of try to understand Russia's behavior in terms of international relations. I don't think that works, actually, because as I tried to illustrate, Russia is now managing manifestly violating its own national interests. It's driving the country more and more into a rather difficult situation, and therefore the Western approach also to Russia should not follow the sort of traditional principles of international relations, but it should look at the sort of the personal interests of the power holders in the current Russian regime. It should also create security zones. For instance, I mean, the main problem that I see basically for the next years is I think neither the Baltic countries, because they are protected. For the regime, it would not make sense to. It would maybe, if the regime would be really ideological, it would make, in a way, more sense for Russia to occupy, let's say, Narva than the Donbass, because the Russian speakers in Estonia have fewer rights than in Ukraine, where they are citizens, whereas in Estonia, many of the Russian speakers are still not citizens of Estonia. But we shouldn't be, but this is not something that, these sort of national interest is not what is driving Russia. Russia is driving rather the private interests of the power holders, and they will not get into, I think, into a conflict with NATO, because that would be too costly, a conflict that would contradict the private interests of the current power holders. Also, I think the countries that are currently in the Eurasian Economic Union, they are basically safe as long as they are part of this project. The real problem is going to be, as I mentioned in the beginning, the gray zone. These are the countries that are neither nor, and I think the Western countries, and maybe also Romania, they should think about what to do with this gray zone, with Moldova, with Ukraine, with Georgia, because this will be basically the playing field for the Russian regime for the next years, the playing field on which the Russian regime will try to legitimize its rule in Russia. So this is going to be, I think, the challenge for the next years, and it's not going to be, Poland or the Baltic countries or Gotland. There was recently this whole panic about that Russia would occupy Gotland. I think that's out of question. For Romania, to finish with that, I think that should mean also following Romanian national interests would, I think, be trying to stabilize Ukraine, because if Ukraine remains destabilized, if Russia is given free hand in Ukraine as before to legitimize its rule domestically with more adventures in Ukraine, I think it would be then in the interests of Romania to try to prevent this, because there could be potentially millions of refugees from destabilized Ukraine flowing into Eastern Europe, including Romania. And I think the conclusion for Romania would be to try to engage in an international internationally embedding Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. I finish on that, and we'll be happy to listen to your questions, to answer them. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Vasif Hüseyinov. I am coming from Germany. I do my PhD in Göttingen University. I have two questions. You have mentioned revisionism as the foreign policy approach of Russian policymakers. I don't know if I missed or not, but I kindly ask you to clarify what you mean by revisionism, and which foreign policy actions of the Russian government you think that are revisionist. And my second question is about Budapest Memorandum. As you mentioned, Russia has taken obligation to protect Ukrainian territorial integrity, and so did United States as well. Do you think that United States kept its promise, and do the foreign policy of the United States suffice to protect the territorial integrity of Ukraine nowadays. Thank you.
Thanks. So, okay, good.
Thank you. My name is David Matsaberzet, Tbilisi State University, Department of IR. At the point when you are talking about the international relations, how international relations theories could reflect on the Russian actions, revisionist pragmatism, do you think that there is also a place to look through what is Russia is doing through the prism of what is called reflexive control towards the EU, and this is the main gap of the EU dealing with Russia? And the second point, last point, and the main problem attached to this is that when you're talking about national interests, Russia is not seeking national interests, but rather the great powerness, which excludes to be a nation state in a classical understanding within the IR. And the last point you mentioned, how to deal with the security of the post-Soviet countries, whether intermarium is really viable, what you were arguing in different papers, what I saw. Thank you.
Okay. I have now 5. Maybe I should answer, because there are 5 questions, I just forget them. Yeah, I mean, revisionism, in a way, all countries have, to a certain degree, revisionist policies, foreign policy, in that they want to revise international relations, in their, from their national interests or in accordance with their sort of national idea or their national ideals. So it's a sort of, it can, revisionism, as I would see it, has a wide range of possible interpretations. It can be very aggressive, but it can be also very sort of, revisionist policies can be carried out with soft power instruments as well, I would say. I mean, what I find the paradox is that a revisionist policy of Russia would be rather to recreate a sphere of influence around it, and that its current seemingly revisionist policies, let's say, towards Ukraine, they undermine this actually, because they create, as I mentioned, for instance, insecurity in Belarus and in Kazakhstan about the national sovereignty of these countries that are already sort of in the Russian sphere of influence. And in that way, it is, of course, revisionist. It's very much about the past and so on, but it's also it's even in this revisionist sense, it's contradictory. It actually, in a way, you could argue, it hinders a revision, so to say, of international relations to the advantage of Russia, because it creates too many new front lines in Ukraine with the Arab world, or with the, let's say, the recent escalation with Turkey. This is sort of, it doesn't make sense in a way. Even if you think of Moscow as being a country that is interested in restoring great power status, the behavior is so erratic and can be, I think, explained only with domestic factors, that it's not really a revisionist in a way, because it's sort of, there's no strategic vision behind the revision that Russia is doing. So that's, I think, what I would say on this. But I think, revisionism I wouldn't say it's a loaded term. You could also say transformatism or something like that. So all countries, I think, want to revise international relations in a way to their advantage. Yeah, with the Budapest Memorandum, yes, I mean that the Ukrainians have been arguing that it has not only been signed by Russia, but also by the US and Great Britain, and then there's the question of what this memorandum means. So only now we know that this memorandum is different, let's say, from the security treaty between the US and South Korea of 1953, where the US guaranteed South Korean security, and one interpretation of the Budapest Memorandum that this US should have similar obligations with regard to Ukraine. That could be one of the readings of this very short text, but it now turns out it's not. But still, of course, the US has imposed sanctions. The US has been, in the whole concert of the Western reaction to this, to the annexation of Crimea and the covert war in the Donbass. Still, it's a hawk within the whole Western, and also Britain is a hawk within the whole Western community. But the Ukrainians would argue, of course, that this is not enough. I mean, you've signed this thing with us, and we want weapons and not individual sanctions against people in Moscow or something like that. This is we interpret that in a different way. And as I said, I mean, the real disturbing thing about this is that it undermines the logic of the non-proliferation regime, because if even a country that has had once over 4,000 nuclear weapons, of different size, and then gave it up and gets this Budapest memorandum, and by the way, also documents from the Chinese government and from the French government. They also gave Ukraine separate governmental declarations, also in December 1994. If even that country is not secure from expansion, from territorial expansion, from a guarantee power of the nuclear proliferation treaty, the big five are, of course, the guarantee countries. Then what is the whole treaty about? Then it's actually, I mean, the odd thing is it becomes actually an instrument in that case of Russia for promoting its national interests, at the expense of a country that has no nuclear weapons. And the logical conclusion is then, of course, well, you should get nuclear weapons, because all these, papers that we sign, they don't count anything. So this is really a problem. In Ukraine, some people say Ukraine should have asked in 1994 for NATO membership in exchange for giving up its there's also a sort of an intermediate structure. Maybe this is still possible if Clinton becomes president, of the so-called major non-aligned major non-NATO ally. There's a particular type of treaties that the US signs with certain countries that are not NATO members, and this is called MNNA, major non-NATO ally, and maybe Ukraine can get something like that. Yeah, reflexive control. I think I wouldn't. It's obviously an old tool of the KGB, and I'm not sure it makes sense today that much anymore, because I think reflexive control was once developed against the background of a universalist ideology, which was communism, and now I think it's more difficult, because Russia has no universalist ideology. Its ideology is basically imperial nationalism, and then it's Russian world or Eurasianism or Pan-Slavism or however. So and under these conditions, I think reflexive control, it's still an instrument, but the context is different, and it doesn't work as well. It's you could say Russian peculiar Soviet maybe form of soft power. So I wouldn't make a particular case here out of this. Yeah, great power interests. I mean, you could also say great power interests instead of national interests, but that's what I've tried to illustrate, that Russia, in order to be a great power, it needs a modernized economy. It needs to play international games, and if it opens itself, if it loses the West as a partner with which it can play a game, and it opens itself towards China, it's actually violating the whole, sort of whole great power logic, how it should behave, really. This is, you could call it national interest or great power interest, but the Russian economy is smaller than the Californian economy, or now it's smaller. It used to be smaller than the Italian economy. Now it's smaller than the Spanish economy. And then Russia could still be a great power, but now it's just it's a great power just by virtue of scaring everybody. With its conventional weapons, with its nuclear weapons, but this is, but then it's losing partners, it's losing support internationally. It's now getting into, let's say, into an entirely new conflict with the Arab world, with what it's doing in Aleppo. I think these pictures, they are horrible for us. I don't know much about the Arab world, but I could imagine that there are many people in the Arab world who don't like these pictures of killed children in Aleppo. And finally, the intermarium. This was my indication at the end when I mentioned, what should Romania do. I mean, as I see it, I think the Romania and Slovakia and Hungary and Poland, they should all have an immediate interest in the stability of Ukraine in particular. Just the most obvious thing being the potentially millions of 45 million people. And if the country destabilizes, then that's obviously Putin's policy, which he tries to do with different things. Among them reflexive control, but military means. This is the whole concept of hybrid war. Then that could become a genuine national security issue also for Romania, and the same goes for Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, the immediate countries that are geographically closest. And I'm a little bit surprised. We would think that this should be because these people, they will run first to these countries if things go really bad, and then I think that should then be a stronger interest into embedding these countries. I mean, in a way, you could approach the whole thing under in a totally abstract way under international relations. You don't look at Russia, you don't look at the EU. You just have, you have one block, you have the second block, and you have the gray zone. And the gray zone, it was almost natural that the gray zone would become a problem sooner or later. And that has to be solved somehow. Maybe with the intermarium, maybe with an East European alliance. I know this is very controversial. I've tried to present that in Poland, where it comes from. It's an old concept of Pilsudski, and it has sort of a deep history there, and I guess it's the main thing here is, I guess, in Romania, as in Poland, is that there is fear here among the East Europeans into getting into a conflict with Russia that would then perhaps weaken in a way the protection within NATO. That so, if you become too active outside NATO, then this would actually weaken Lithuania's or Poland's or Romania's position within NATO. This is, I think, what many people fear, and that's so. There's, at least in Poland, there's a lot of sympathy for Ukraine. I don't know how it's here in Romania. It's not just interest-driven; it's also emotionally, I would say, driven. But still, there is fear to engage, because then the question is always, okay, if we now go into an alliance with Ukraine, what is with our own security? And the same goes for the Baltic countries, and I assume something like here. So what I would imagine is if the current regime in Russia stays in the future, and if Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia cannot enter the EU or NATO, I think both of this, it's the most likely version. I think then there would have to be some other solution for this gray zone, and maybe then, I don't know, I mean, it would have to be it could be informal, but better, of course, would be a formal agreement, maybe modeled on the Turkish Azeri security treaty, where these countries are then included into some sort of alliance that would create in Russia. I think it's mainly about perception, the perception that these countries are not any longer alone. I mean, I think the big issue actually was with the annexation of Crimea and the Donbas issue, because it looked so easy. It was lying there. It was, you could just take it, and it wouldn't cost anything, And first it was like that. It didn't cost anything. The first sanctions after annexation of Crimea were fairly symbolic, and then when the war started in eastern Ukraine, the sanctions became more serious. So the perception was here, I think, one of the major drivers. It looked all very easy, like with Abkhazia and so. Why not take it? I mean, why take away and why not take Odessa next year? who would, because Ukraine is a weak country, okay, it has now a stronger military, but it's just Ukraine, and Russia always wins against Ukraine or Georgia or Moldova. So, and the perception has to be changed, and inter marium would not be, a major change, but it would increase, it would create the perception in Russia, okay, if we go against this country, we have 6 others also against us, yeah? And then at least, it wouldn't be a minor conflict anymore. It wouldn't be as easy as before. And I think that's eventually in the national interests of Romania to have this sort of higher stability and international embeddedness of Ukraine. Yeah. Yeah, whoever gets the mic first.
Thank you very much, Mr. Umland. That's the first analysis which I've heard for, let's say, for the second or third year, which is completely corresponds to my feelings and to my perceptions. My name is Professor Zadorozhny. I'm a chair of the International Law Department at the Kyiv National University. And my question is, and excuse me for its, for the meaning of the question, but in the other, that all Ukrainians are asking themselves, what really Putin wants? And that would be very interesting for me to hear your answer on that. What are the real aims of that regime? To this, whatever. But what are the real aims? They contradict the national interest of Russia, and I completely agree with you, with all 6 points. They contradict to the, let's say, personal interest of most Russian businessmen, whom we are meeting in Kiev, in Ukraine. They contradict all the other interests, personal, psychological, and the others. But what are the real aims? Or the aim, just to stabilize the country and to, let's say, to conserve the regime for eternity, and that's it. Thank you.
So another one there.
Sorin Ioniță, I'm from the civil society in Romania. I have 2 questions for you. One regarding the energy and the energy policy. I think one of the reasons, one of the causes of Soviet Union collapse was the subsidization of the communist blocs through energy policy, through cheap energy, actually. Yeah. It has continued with Russia, and I'm asking you for a diagnosis. What are they doing today on average? Are they subsidizing or exploiting the near abroad or the countries with which they have commercial relations through energy policy? And if they are still subsidizing, how sustainable is this in domestic politics in Russia? Is this a theme of discussion? Can they go any longer with subsidizing, places like Belarus or Transnistria or forever? That's my first question. And the second question is about the German foreign policy in the area. Do we have one German foreign policy, or we have a Christian democratic one and a socialist one in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs? Because people are pretty confused in places like Chisinau, for example, where they saw very, very divergent pressures from the same capital, which is Berlin, and Berlin is an important capital in Europe. So they've got very, very discrepant messages, and they don't know how to interpret it, actually. Should we listen to the socialists or to the Christian Democrats in Germany?
Hello, my name is Angela, I'm just a student. I have first a comment and then some question. You were mentioning about the security, the stabilization of the zone that should come from Romania's side. In my point of view, Romania is really weak in what concerns security reasons, just taking into consideration that just with the new president, Klaus Iohannis, that we had, he succeeded to have in 6 months, as Constitution says, the national security plan. But our former president, Trump, says, didn't even do this, and was against constitution in these reasons. So I think that we are just getting legally, to say like this. And what do you think is Romania's importance in these circumstances in the Black Sea region? And that's all. Thank you.
Okay.
Microphone, I have a strong enough voice. Theodor Moga from Alexandria University, Iași. For the sake of debate, I would like to ask you if you perhaps consider, we can still consider the IR perspective, keeping in mind that one explanation for Russia's behavior could be understood from a feeling of its own insecurity, and perhaps some of its actions are stemming from, yes, an existential insecurity, considering perhaps some of the moves of the West in the eastern neighborhood of the European Union.
Okay, good. Okay, I've been asked to answer very, very briefly. So, yeah, I mean, what Putin wants, I mean, that's what I try to illustrate. It's not about Russia, it's about the regime. It's about, preserving the regime, finding a new legitimization code after the old legitimization mode, after the old deal broke down, I mean, the old deal could work again if the oil prices go up. Then, but maybe that's also now too late for that. Even if the oil prices could go up, the sort of, as I said, the genie is out of the bottle. This whole sort of ultranationalist discourse has become mainstream, and to get it into the bottle is maybe not any longer possible. Yeah, and then to keep the regime as long as possible, and I think the West should they should have that in mind. How can the West create a stronger threat for the regime than the West should recalculate, or should trigger recalculation of the regime's interests, by for instance increasing the costs for these foreign adventures. I think the biggest leverage that we have are, of course, not export sanctions that we have now imposed, but import sanctions. I mean, that's the odd thing that the European Union is indirectly co-financing what is happening in Syria and in Moldova and in the Donbas and Crimea and South Ossetia, because we have this huge energy trade with Russia, and much of this oil we don't need to buy in Russia. We can buy it somewhere else. I mean, there's a whole debate in Germany about this alleged dependence that the West has. It's an alleged dependence. It's not a real one. Yeah, that also links up here to the question about energy policy. Yeah, I think there are now all these contradictions emerging, that Russia has these imperial projects, so to say, of either sort of softer projects like in Belarus, let's say, or the harder projects like in Transnistria or in the Donbas or South Ossetia, and it has to subsidize all this. It has to finance all this. It's not so much. It's not only about energy. It's in general about money, budget money, and energy subsidies are just one of the instruments of this of securing these imperial projects. But this will become now more and more, I think, problematic, because especially when more and more people understand how much money this takes up, I think the major issue is going to be actually Crimea, because Crimea is now within the Russian Federation the most highly subsidized, by far most highly subsidized region, and how long are the Russians going to keep up with that when the living standard goes down? So I think energy subsidies are just one of these issues, subsidies in general. Yeah, German foreign policy. That's I think there's a strange pathology, I would say, in the social. I mean, we can understand, of course, why the radical right, why the Alternative for Germany supports Russia. This is within the general far right support for Putin. But why do why do the Social Democrats, and there is this, this tradition of the Ostpolitik, and I think there's a sort of cognitive dissonance here that that people don't understand actually that we are not in the 1970s anymore, that Brezhnev's Soviet Union was a status quo power, whereas Putin wants exactly to it's an anti-status quo power, and to have the same policies towards a status quo power and a revisionist power does not make sense. But my feeling is that the understanding is growing that this does not. Of course, there's also just plain corruption with people like Gerhard Schröder going on. But I think it's slowly changing. The German public has been changing for the last 3 years, but also people in the Social Democratic Party have been changing. Stabilizing the zone and the weakness of Romania, yes, of course. Romania is not a major power, neither is Poland, neither is Lithuania. But still, these are all countries in the region, and people. A friend of mine, when I said intermarium, he asked, "What do you say, delphinarium?" They make fun of that. I'm not a friend of this intermarium idea, but if you look at all the other options, they are either impossible or worse. The other option is actually just leaving as it is. But we have the experience now with what this gray zone leads to, and there's no reason to believe that just leaving it as it is in the future will somehow turn out better. So, and membership in the EU, membership in NATO, a security treaty between the US and Ukraine, like the one between the US and South Korea, major non-aligned ally status. All of these look maybe the non-aligned non-NATO ally status is something, but still it would be maybe not sufficient. So I think if there would be this alliance of these countries in the region, that would be still better for countries like Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia than no alliance. And the same goes for the Black Sea region. The big joker, of course, in the Black Sea region is Turkey. So that we have now this rapprochement between Turkey and Russia. But there's so many conflicts. Syria, Nagorno-Karabakh, and Turkey has an alliance treaty with Azerbaijan. So if that becomes problematic again, it's going to be a proxy war between Azerbaijan, between Russia and Turkey on Azeri oil. The Crimean Tatars and the Kurds, and maybe also Central Asia. So there are at least these 5 points where Russia and Turkey have competing, if not conflictual interests. And that will be, I think, in the future very interesting to see. And the insecurity issue, finally, of course, this is the major discourse here in Russia and also in the West to justify all this as a reaction, because the West was so. But look, for instance, at Moldova. Moldova has in 1994 put into its constitution, I think it's Article 11, non-bloc status, and it concluded also in 1994 a treaty with Russia about the withdrawal of troops, and in this. So Moldova says we are not going to become a NATO member. Moldova concludes a treaty about withdrawal of troops, but the troops remain, of course. So this is just an illustration for me that it's not about security so much. And I think the people in Moscow understand that they have overkill capacity. Russia is not Serbia. They can blow up the whole humanity several times, and they know that everybody else knows that. And so I think this whole discourse of the poor Russia that is threatened by NATO, and the whole conflict was not about NATO. It was the association agreements. Armenia is a member of the ODKB, the Tashkent Treaty, but still they had to stop this association agreement. This is because it's the politics that is threatening, the domestic politics of Armenia, of Ukraine. They could become models for Russian domestic politics. That's what is, and they are a problem for the regime. That's why they fear in a way the EU more than NATO, because the EU is actually exporting a model of society that is in direct competition to Putin's model, and that's why they react so aggressively when the EU tries to export its societal model.
Thank you very much. I'm sure there will be other questions in our coffee break, which we are taking now.
Policy, so just waiting you back in 15 minutes. Thank you.